It incorporates physical risks, it incorporates reputational risk, financial risk, and so to the extent possible, we would like to see an agreement that sends clearer signals about the way in which the international community is going to go about trying to solve the challenge of climate change. As I mentioned, our preference, as articulated by our CEO, is for some kind of price signal on carbon, some kind of carbon pricing mechanism, not necessarily uniform. We're not that idealistic, not necessarily a globally uniform pricing signal, but a market mechanism applied to the challenge of emissions reductions in jurisdictions in which we operate. I know that this is a contentious issue when it comes to the multilateral negotiation process. I'm not sure if we have great expectations that there will be references to market mechanisms in the final agreement, but it would be nice to come out of this negotiation process with that being an issue that is discussed next. I'd be curious to hear Eliza's kind of view of how much the question of markets and market instruments will feature in the final agreement. But that's our view. Certainty to the extent possible, and ambitious enough to keep us on the 2-degree pathway.
Well, as you perhaps inferred from my comments, I very much hope that Paris is successful, but I don't think the route to serious reductions is an agreement among 100 states. I think it's getting serious by a handful of major emitters who then gradually coalesce into some global regime. And so that piece I wrote in Science 15 years ago said it's great to continue these international negotiations, but at the same time, the international community ought to start thinking a bit about how do you incentivize these collaborative activities. Does it take carbon border tariffs and adjustment tariffs and things like that? So I hope that Paris is successful, but I don't see it as the most promising route to getting really serious reductions. I agree entirely that market-based strategies are great, but they're not great for everything. I mean, for example, here in the US, $1 a ton is a penny a gallon at the gas pump. And I can't imagine the US having a price on carbon of more than $20 or $30 a ton in the near future. And we know what 20 or 30 cent change in the price of gas does. It does not transform transportation. And so I think a mixed strategy with some performance standards combined with some market-based standards is what's most important. I hope my two colleagues are right, but I think we lost the chance for 2 degrees about 25 years ago. I would love to be 35 next year. There are some things, despite the fact that you'd really love to have them, you can't have, and I don't know how we get to 2 degrees.
So those are some excellent points, and I've certainly heard that point made before, that while these international agreements are important, there also needs to be, there's a role to be played by the business community, and there are other mechanisms that need to be brought to bear. And so the other thing that everyone so far has mentioned is the need for price signals and some sort of a price on carbon. Now I know a lot of major oil companies already bake a carbon price into their financials, and there certainly seems to be momentum in this direction, but there's not a lot of agreement about what the best approach is with a carbon tax or a cap and trade system. We heard yesterday that the cap and trade system, someone expressed a view that there is too much volatility associated with that, and maybe that's not the best approach. Do you guys have a feeling, what system do you think might work better? you want to talk a little bit more about?
Anyone you can get the U.S. Congress to approve.
All right.
You don't want the perfect to be the enemy of the good in this space. So anything we can get in place that begins to price carbon, either directly or indirectly, is what I think is really needed.
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, we have a large business in Europe, and Europe's approach to this was the EU ETS, which is a cap and trade system, and which has had some teething problems, to say the least. They're now looking at how to reform it, how to take out some of the excess credit in the system, and to then have businesses face a price on carbon that changes investment and changes behavior. Here in the US, we have a system that is kind of philosophically more market-oriented, but as we saw from Professor Granger, we are now facing this very centralized command and control approach to emissions reduction, which is in effect putting a price on carbon in the power sector, and at the same time putting in place a kind of de facto cap and trade system. If you look at how the Clean Power Plan in its final form is structured and written, and the federal plan, which is the option for states that choose not to comply or to submit implementation plans, that will also, we understand, have some element of cap and trade in it. So we're seeing, I think, an indirect pricing of carbon in the power sector and an indirect approach to cap and trade, which I think is probably less efficient than it could be.
Yeah, so let me say something optimistic with respect to the U.S. plan. I mean, there are growing signs that many states are going to engage in a multi-state trading regime. And I think that's a very positive development, because that will scale up. I mean, once you get those institutions, well, we have, you know, Reggie in the Northeast, and we have West Coast things, and if we can make that grow and become a close to national trading system, then that's a scheme that does scale. And so that's one of the more positive developments as a result of the EPA's rules.
And it was notable that one of the signature developments, one of the few from the Xi visit last month, was the announcement that China would engage in a nationwide cap and trade rollout in 2017. So we have Europe with a cap and trade system, albeit flawed. We have China on the verge of expanding its pilot system nationwide. We have the US implementing a kind of single sector, albeit but a significant cap and trade system in effect. So I think, I mean, in the spirit of kind of coalescing regimes, there may be some trend emerging when it comes to trading and market emission.
Yeah, and on the technology side, the US has CAFE, which is gradually moving us in the direction of reduced emissions.
But I think this conversation, as I think I mentioned in my remarks, I think it's probably due, and it probably will come after Paris, where we're seeing, sitting in Washington, it's interesting, the kind of conventional wisdom has been that there is no prospect of pricing, a legislative approach to carbon pricing in the US. There is no chance of it happening. I mean, I think that is still the prevailing kind of orthodoxy, but there are more conversations, more serious conversations about carbon pricing, tax, how you use the revenue, cap and trade versus tax that have emerged in the last 6 months, and I think that might be an indication that this conversation is coming back.
Yeah, and you got to differentiate from inside the Beltway and the discussions that are going on among the states. I mean, among the states, and I go to lots of meetings with power company officials and folks who are worrying about how we're going to implement the EPA plan, and their trading is very much on the table.
All right. I want to shift gears a little bit back toward Paris specifically and the INDCs. They've played such a large role so far, and there's also been, the point's been made that there's still a gap between the contributions that have been received and where we need to get to achieve this maintain the climate from increasing 2 degrees Celsius. So maybe Eliza could speak to this gap in the INDCs, and what does that mean for the likelihood of achieving an agreement in Paris, or where do we stand with that?
I'll try to link this with the response previously around the market mechanisms. In terms of the agreement, the hope of getting any sort of agreement around market mechanisms is probably one of the most political spaces at the moment in the negotiations. I think the best we can hope for is that the agreement includes an explicit acknowledgement of the ability of parties to use market mechanisms in implementing their INDCs. One of the core concerns and why this is sort of somewhat political is how to actually make sure that there's no double counting and that all the accounting processes are agreed, and it starts getting into the MRV discussions there. So that is why it's slightly messy. But to link that to the INDCs, what we saw in most parties, particularly developing countries as well, communicating their INDCs, is they're all very keen to be able to use market mechanisms to achieve their contribution. So I think the will is there. I think there's just the technical points to be worked out, which is somewhat promising. What was your actual question? INDCs. I think everyone is relatively surprised at the number of INDCs communicated before Paris. So I think it's actually a very good signal that most countries have gone through the process of doing an INDC. As I said, most developing countries, first time they've ever put forward a mitigation contribution. I think the trick with everything is that a lot of these contributions are somewhat conditional on finance. And I think it's marrying up the public finance with these contributions, how you monitor that over time, as to how some of these contributions actually play out in reality, and whether they're implemented, I suppose, and implemented in the way that they are currently envisaged. What else?
Yeah, well, that kind of leads right into the issue of how to fund these national efforts, and the financing of these national efforts, and then maybe the grievances on behalf of the developing countries in some cases that feel that a lot of this carbon was put up into the atmosphere by the developed world, and so perhaps maybe they should bear a greater proportion of the cost. So I think, how might these financing challenges be dealt with?
Big question. I think obviously public finance, the provision of adequate public finance is critical, everyone knows that, but I think the discussion, I mentioned this earlier, is more and more turning to how can that public finance be used to shift the trillions, because that's what is needed to achieve the type of action that we need to see. So it's not just about a numbers game of adding up how much public finance we have and matching it perfectly to what is put forward in the INDC. So certainly a component of that, but it's how this agreement can help sort of catalyse these sort of new shifts around finance that is going to be so important to see in the agreement. In terms of sort of the other key issue in the negotiations is obviously the split in public finance between mitigation and adaptation. So much of what was communicated in the INDCs from developing countries was around their need to build their resilience to undertake adaptation. And a lot of the narrative or the lens for developing countries in understanding their sort of putting forward a mitigation component was looking at those actions where there's a mitigation component and an adaptation benefit, if you like. So finance is going to play a huge role in not only meeting their adaptation needs, but sort of spurring some of that low carbon, or the shift towards a low carbon pathway at the same time. So having that reflected in the agreement is going to be critical, reflecting that the importance of that balance. The GCF, the Green Climate Fund, the main sort of climate finance fund moving forward, already has a commitment around that balance. That will be critical, seeing that forward. In terms of actual numbers in the agreement, a number is on the table. I mean, there's the concept of 100 billion, the pledge from developed countries to provide 100 billion. We're getting, there's a lot of different ways to assess that and analyse that. I am not a hardcore finance negotiator, but that's tough. But I don't think we're going to see numbers. Well, we won't see numbers in the agreement. We're not going to see a commitment to reach X amount of public finance in the agreement. What we're going to see in the agreement is the mechanisms necessary to get to those sort of higher finance numbers and the signals around how to leverage public finance to get, again, to those shifting the trillions that we really need to. So, sorry, that's probably a fuzzy negotiating answer, but it's a very, very tough aspect of negotiations.
So, yeah, thank you. So maybe we shift gears now back more toward the technological side and some of the other things that can be done. So coal to gas switching was mentioned, so something more in the realm of the business community. And that's certainly happening here in the US because of decrease in natural gas prices. Where else might that be possible in the world? Do you see, maybe Kevin, from your view, some other places where that's happening or it's possible?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting situation that you have here in the US. We were part of Cove Point when it was a proposed LNG import terminal. I'm sorry, yes, sure. The situation in the US is a unique one so far in that the commercialization of shale gas here has totally changed the energy fortunes and the relative fortunes of coal and gas. We as Statoil were part of the Cove Point LNG import facility as it was then. It is now approved to export LNG from the US and we'll see the first cargoes of LNG leave the US early next year. That is liquefied natural gas. And so the outlook here was for increasing gas scarcity and coal being the kind of dominant power sector fuel. Technology has transformed that equation. The US story is not immediately applicable elsewhere. There are shale resources elsewhere, but for various reasons, access to capital, regulatory environments, property rights, the US story it cannot be cut and paste elsewhere. In Europe, we have a situation where indigenous gas supplies and production is going down. That's excluding Norway. Norway's production is relatively stable. And we are the second. In fact, this year will be the largest exporter of gas to the European Union. But you have a policy environment that has worked to the disadvantage of natural gas. You have an ETS or a carbon price that is too low to send a signal to switch coal to gas. Then you have a lot of incentives for renewable energy that are policy driven and an end in themselves. Germany is a very good example of this. And so in Europe, you're seeing the share of natural gas in the power sector go down, while the share of lignite and hard coal remains relatively stable, and the share of renewables increases. So you have a relatively high cost, relatively high emissions outcome, which I don't think is what was intended. And then in China, you are seeing the policy ambition to shift to a greater share of natural gas in the economy. Some of the, I think, internal company dynamics and economic dynamics within China mean that that is harder than it looks. But there is potential for coal to gas switching in China. I think the Chinese government recognizes that as a near-term air quality solution. And the Chinese are looking actively at diversifying their gas supplies and increasing their gas supplies from China, from Central Asia, from Myanmar and elsewhere, and through LNG. So I think the story for gas is, and gas in the global power sector is still a positive one. It's less positive than it was a few years ago. The IEA's global golden age of gas is probably less golden than it looked a few years ago. But I think that's, in terms of scalable, meaningful emissions reductions that are kind of real and achievable right now, the replacement of coal with natural gas is difficult to beat.
So we're not going to decarbonize the energy system in an affordable way with the technology options we've got on the table today. I mean, some of them will help considerably, but we need some dramatic improvements in the available portfolio of technology, and there aren't going to be any silver bullets in the sense of a single technology that will solve the problem. So one of the things that I am particularly concerned about is the relatively modest levels of investment in the development of new technologies that will allow us to decarbonize the energy system. You're right, Statoil has done a wonderful job for over 20 years at Schlagner in separating. I mean, this is not from combustion sources. This is the natural gas that's being produced in the offshore Norwegian fields, comes with CO2, and in the past, of course, you always had to separate it. But in the past, you separated it, invented it, and now because of Norwegian law, it's separated and sequestered. And so there's a big technology base there. But that sort of thing only happens if there, as there was in Norway, laws that say you got to do this, you can't you can't emit. But for storage technology, for nuclear technology, the U.S. Department of Energy continues to talk about small modular reactors, but we're essentially dead in the water in that space. Now the Koreans, the Chinese, and several others are working hard, but advanced reactor design, I mean, I have a doctoral student who's, I guess not in the back of the room, but who was down at Oak Ridge the other day, and they were bemoaning the fact that they got no money to work on advanced reactor designs. The NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, doesn't have the capability to figure out how to evaluate non-light water designs. There's no DOE national lab where the developers of the private developers of advanced reactor designs can go and play and run experiments to refine the technologies. Now, I understand that at least parts of Europe have decided we're going to do this without nukes, but of course the Germans are perfectly happy to buy their electricity from France and Eastern Europe, their nuclear power. I'm technology agnostic. I mean, it's going to take a portfolio of everything we've got, and even then we're going to have great difficulty getting there. But we need a much more vigorous program in technology development, and until, as you say, there's some serious price on carbon or some other incentive, there's no reason why private sector firms who operate in a market where they got to satisfy shareholders are going to get out front on this sort of stuff, which means that government needs to dramatically up its game in terms of technology development.
Wow, indeed. I think that's a great segue to open it up to questions from the audience. So I have a microphone here, and identify yourself, and please ask a question if you'd like. Do we have any questions?
Yeah, over here.
Okay.
My name is Wei Pan. I am a student in Princeton University. So I have a comment, but I would like to hear the thoughts from all the distinguished panelists here. I work on China's energy strategy. How can we design it in a way we can simultaneously reduce air pollution and carbon emissions? So I especially agree with Professor Morgan's idea. It is very important for us to make strategic investment in energy sector today so that we won't be locked in inferior long-term choices in terms of like carbon emissions. I have an optimistic example to share today from China. That's also the project I'm going to present tomorrow. That is, because of this air pollution crisis, China is expanding its long-distance transmission capacity from the western part of China to the eastern part of China. Even though the aim is to reduce eastern air pollution, it has the potential to transmit renewable power from the west to the east. And I personally believe, and I believe many of the Chinese would agree with me, is that this is a strategic movement from the point of the state-owned enterprises, a great company in China called State Grid Corporation of China. I also saw the logo of State Grid in Kevin Massy's presentation just now. So for them, as a transmission grid company, they definitely also have the incentive to make this investment, which is good for them, for their companies. So I guess my comments or like my question in general is that honestly, even for China, I haven't seen that many examples where we can see aligned interests between these climate goals and a very strong company or like interest group who's also in line with climate actions. So I'm just wondering, like globally or even domestically, do you think it is possible for us to have kind of like having some very strong players on board in this game so that we can move forward as a country or as like international community?
So in the power area, you're absolutely right. China is building more new technology than virtually all the rest of the world put together. I mean, China has built thousands of kilometers of high voltage DC transmission, for example, much more than anybody else is building. China is building all kinds of, we talk about microgrids. We don't tend to talk about who owns them, which I think is a mistake, but we talk about microgrids and combined heat and power. China is building these things in several dozen cities. And so if you're looking for test beds where new technology can get developed and made cost effective, China is a wonderful place to be looking. And furthermore, if you asked me where will large-scale commercial CCS first take off, I mean, the first commercial scale CCS plants are just coming up now, but my bet is that China will probably end up leading the world in that space as well.
I'll stray a little bit into the political world here, but it is, I think, clear that any meaningful effort to address the challenge of carbon emissions requires concerted government action and private sector investment. In the US, we have a vibrant private sector, but the government decision-making process and the ability of the government to do these bold things is pretty constrained. We see there's over 100 parties that have already filed a lawsuit against the Clean Power Plan, which, as we've just heard, is itself not sufficient to really get us where we need to be, but even that is going to find itself subject to a huge amount of resistance and political headwinds. So there is a need for governments to act in bold ways, and it seems like one of the greatest hopes in that respect is the Chinese government's willingness to focus on this issue and to deploy resources and investment to scale up some of the technologies that are going to be used globally. So I'm not sure what that says about the relative merits of the different kind of governance systems, but for this challenge, you need strong political leadership and the ability to execute.
Yeah, although my sense from talking with the folks that I work with who are experts in China is that China too has decided that they can't sort of go out and order this stuff. They're going to use market-based mechanisms to try to make much of it happen. But we've got another comment here.
If I can just
Oh yeah, sure, absolutely.
my 3 cents worth on the China situation that I didn't mention when I was talking about finance is the importance of China's recent commitment in terms of finance. So the $3.1 billion that it's recently pledged, I think last month, coming up from the 10 million that it had sort of pledged before to South-South cooperation and assisting other countries. I think that's going to be hugely important, not only just in the finance, but I think hopefully some of the technology transfer and development and the increased leadership that we're going to see from China as shown by their financial commitment. So,
Mike.
So I'm Mike Keynes with LMI, and the question I suppose is for the panel, although I think much of it is for Eliza. So much of the discussion was on the targets and achieving the 2%, the 2 degree Celsius target in one way or another, and using market mechanisms if possible, but other mechanisms and so on. But Eliza really got into some of the wealth transfer issues that are associated with the agreement, and used the word trillions and used the word adaptation in the developing world and things like that. And these trillions, of course, have to come from somewhere. And I think we're talking OECD, and this means politicians in the OECD countries going back to their home electorates and somehow trying to persuade them that these trillions should be transferred from them to others. And so I'm wondering if in the end, after hearing that, whether you don't think, and whether maybe Granger's solution, where you just sort of have these regional, smaller agreements, and maybe one day they coalesce, aren't going to be the more serious mechanisms to get this all done.
great question. I think both can coexist. Maybe that's being optimistic, but I don't think the international agreement will do everything. I think it can set the big signals, and I think it should not get in the way of the smaller regional agreements. I hope that that's what we end up seeing, because I think we all agree that I think it's a combination of both. I think a lot of the momentum that we've seen, a lot of the bilateral action that we've seen, a lot of the smaller regional-based agreements we've seen if the last year or the last 2 years has been because of the momentum created by the sort of the international process. So insofar as it can sort of set a political signal, set a long-term signal, engage some of the states, and support all the action needed by cities, by regions, by sub-national governments more generally, and by the private sector. I think that's its role. I don't think it's one or the other. I don't think it's the small regional sort of collaboration without an international agreement, and vice versa. In terms of the equity issues, I think that you alluded to around the finance, I think getting significant amounts of public finance is increasingly difficult. I think it's increasing the effectiveness of what that public finance goes to, which is sort of what I was talking about, is really understanding how that can be leveraged, how we can use that to support greater involvement of the private sector. I don't think I think increasing, trying to get, the amount of public finance we need is getting really tough, and we can't rely on that alone, but we can do things more efficiently and more effectively.
So let me just add something, and that is that the world's got lots of problems, of which climate is a big one, but there are plenty of others, equity and development and all those issues. And the minute you put 100 nations in a room together, each one comes with its own agenda. And you open this policy window or space, and you got to expect all these other issues to be addressed. And, I think, for example, that this country spends far too little on development support. The Scandinavian countries do much better than we do. But I think that the issue of pouring all these different problems into the same bucket complicates the problem of making progress on reducing carbon emissions. We're not going to reduce carbon emissions until we got cost-effective ways to do it. And if the developed world, and I include China in the developed world in this context because their technology is cutting edge in many areas, until the developed world gets the technologies that will allow you to decarbonize in an affordable way, it's not reasonable to ask many countries where, you know, half their citizens are living on $1 a day to make, I mean, those countries need energy. And, you know, people complain that you get big rebound effects. Well, you get big rebound effects when you introduce energy efficiency in very low income places, because there's enormous utility that comes from being able to use energy for other purposes. So, I mean, I wish Paris luck, but I think that's not where the action's going to be.
In the back there.
I guess I'll just talk loudly. Greg Shively, I'm from, or do you want me to?
No, I'll repeat the question.
We can hear you.
We
Just
Greg
yell.
Shively, I'm from Carnegie Mellon. As Granger pointed out, there needs to be vision of what is going to be a roadblock or what is ultimately necessary in climate policies. Glenn Peters in Norway has pointed out that in the RCP scenarios leading to a 2 degrees C by 2100, almost every single one of them has net negative emissions for the entire globe. And that you're largely going to get there only with bioenergy and CCS. So if that's something that is probably going to be needed in order to hit 2 degrees C, is there any focus on it? Is anybody even talking about it yet, given how incredibly difficult it's going to be?
Did everyone hear the question?
I mean, the question was the viability of CCS and of achieving negative emissions with biofuels, including doing capture, presumably with biomass energy. And I mean, I guess, so I have just two comments. The first is, I think it's much more useful to think about where we end up as the emergent consequence of a whole lot of separate decisions, rather than a vision that says the world chooses a target and we all aim for it. Targets can be very useful, but I think it's more realistic to, everybody needs to push like hell and we see where we end up. On CCS, I pushed Julio Friedman. Julio Friedman is the undersecretary who's responsible for, among other things, CCS in the Department of Energy at the moment. In Europe, there's been big pushback on CCS. I mean, Statoil can do it because it's out under the North Sea, but doing it in many other places where you get, you know, micro tremors and things is a problem. Now, we are fortunate. We got plenty of pore space. But I pushed Julio the other day saying, suppose there's pushback and you make the you get the capture technology cheap enough, but then it turns out that for various public relations issues not related to whether or not there's enough pore space, you can't use all that pore space. You capture the stuff and you got to do something else with it. Is DOE doing anything to explore that issue? And the answer was no. There's plenty of pore space. So.
Yeah, just on CCS. There are unique circumstances in the Norwegian continental shelf that policy circumstances, geologic opportunities.
Yeah, and in North Africa too.
North Africa, and we have sequestered oil as a carbon in Algeria too. I think CCS has been the story that didn't happen in many respects. It was people think it's either just around the corner or it's science fiction, and there doesn't seem to be a lot of middle space.
Although, I mean, people keep saying this was the thing that didn't happen, but the problem is it's not going to happen until there's some reason you have to do it economically. I mean, if I can emit CO2 to the atmosphere for free, why in heaven's name should I capture it and stick it underground?
Exactly.
Yeah. So I can do it, and technically it's known how to do it, and we need to sort of get over the learning curve so we start, I mean, the first few plants are going to not work too well, and we're going to have to get over that bump and come down. But until we got some, you know, either a price or a legal mandate as Statoil has, we're not going to do it.
Right, and this goes back to the role of the public sector, incentives, subsidies. I mean, it depends, I guess, where you want to allocate this public financing to address the externality and collective action problem that is carbon emissions. And CCS is a scalable, in theory, scalable solution to a large part of this problem. But until there is a mandate or a set of incentives that will force commercial industry to abide by it, it's difficult to see where it's going to come from. One kind of I'm told by reliable sources that there won't be any mention of CCS in the final Paris communique, but the COP22, if you can imagine that now in Marrakesh, will focus on some of the tools that are available to governments and the private sector to implement whatever is decided in Paris. And that might be the time when some of these more kind of operational questions are addressed.
But just, sorry, aside from CCS, the question was negative emission sources. So actually, I mean, is that even a discussion in these forums of, we don't need to just get to zero carbon power, but it might be necessary to get to negative carbon power?
Sure. Well, negative emissions basically requires capture of some sort. It either requires capture from biomass fuel, I mean, the plants take the CO2 out of the atmosphere and then I capture it and put it underground, or it requires direct air scrubbing. The colleagues that I talk with suggest that direct air scrubbing is probably not going to come in at under a couple $100 a ton, maybe 150 if we're lucky. But I think that direct air scrubbing, that is systems that directly scrubs, I mean, the problem is, of course, that the CO2 in the atmosphere is extraordinarily dilute, and so it's a very difficult task in an energy efficient way to scrub the stuff out, but you can do it. And so those are the only two strategies that I know to get negative emissions: scrubbing directly from the atmosphere and using a fuel like biomass where the plant has captured the CO2 and then I scrub it and sequester it.
All right. Well, I want to thank the panelists. We've run out of time. Please join me in thanking the panelists. And thank you all. Our next group event is the Andy Warhol Museum at 6:30. So hope to see you all there. Thank you.